This is Audible.
Audible Studios presents The Sleepwalkers. How Europe Went to War in 1914. Written by Christopher Clark. Narrated by Peter Silverleaf. For Joseph and Alexander. Introduction. The European continent was at peace on the morning of Sunday the 28th of June 1914, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie Chotek arrived at Sarajevo railway station. 37 days later, it was at war. The conflict that began that summer mobilized 65 million troops, claimed 3 empires, 20 million military and civilian deaths, and 21 million wounded. The horrors of Europe's 20th century were born of this catastrophe. It was, as the American historian Fritz Stern put it, the first calamity of the 20th century, the calamity from which all other calamities sprang. The debate over why it happened began before the first shots were fired and has been running ever since. It has spawned an historical literature of unparalleled size, sophistication and moral intensity. For international relations theorists, the events of 1914 remain the political crisis par excellence, intricate enough to accommodate any number of hypotheses. The historian who seeks to understand the genesis of the First World War confronts several problems. The first, and most obvious, is an oversupply of sources. Each of the belligerent states produced official multi-volume editions of diplomatic papers, vast works of collective archival labor. Statesmen, military commanders, ministers, senior officials, adjutants, and courtiers penned diaries and memoirs amounting altogether to many tens of thousands of pages. There are treacherous currents in this ocean of sources. Most of the official document editions produced in the interwar period have an apologetic spin. The 57-volume German publication Die Große Politik, comprising 15,889 documents organized in 300 subject areas, was not prepared with purely scholarly objectives in mind. It was hoped that the disclosure of the pre-war record would suffice to refute the war guilt thesis enshrined in the terms of the Versailles Treaty. For the French government, too, the post-war publication of documents was an enterprise of essentially political character. As Foreign Minister Jean-Louis Barthot put it in May 1934, its purpose was to counterbalance the campaign launched by Germany following the Treaty of Versailles. In Vienna, as Ludwig Bittner, co-editor of the 8-volume collection Österreich-Ungarns Außenpolitik, pointed out in 1926, the aim was to produce an authoritative source edition before some international body, the League of Nations perhaps, forced the Austrian government into publication under less auspicious circumstances. The early Soviet documentary publications were motivated in part by the desire to prove that the war had been initiated by the autocratic Tsar and his alliance partner, the bourgeois Raymond Poincaré, in the hope of delegitimizing French demands for the repayment of pre-war loans. Even in Britain, where British documents on the origins of the war was launched amid high-minded appeals to disinterested scholarship, the resulting documentary record was not without tendentious omissions that produced a somewhat unbalanced picture of Britain's place in the events preceding the outbreak of war in 1914. In short, the great European documentary editions were, for all their undeniable value to scholars, munitions in a world war of documents, as the German military historian Bernhard Schwertfeger remarked in a critical study of 1929. The memoirs of statesmen, commanders, and other key decision-makers, though indispensable to anyone trying to understand what happened on the road to war, are no less problematic. Some are frustratingly reticent on questions of burning interest. To name just 3 examples, the Reflections on the World War published in 1919 by German Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg have virtually nothing to say on the subject of his actions or those of his colleagues during the July crisis of 1914. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Sazonov's political memoirs are breezy, pompous, intermittently mendacious, and totally uninformative about his role in key events. French President Raymond Poincaré's 10-volume memoir of his years in power is propagandist rather than revelatory. There are striking discrepancies between his recollections of events during the crisis and the contemporary jottings in his unpublished diary. The amiable memoirs of British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey are sketchy on the delicate question of the commitments he had made to the Entente powers before August 1914 and the role these played in his handling of the crisis. When the American historian Bernadotte Everly Schmidt of the University of Chicago traveled to Europe in the late 1920s with letters of introduction to interview former politicians who had played a role in these events, he was struck by the apparent total immunity of his interlocutors to self-doubt. The one exception was Grey, who spontaneously remarked that he had made a tactical error in seeking to negotiate with Vienna through Berlin during the July crisis. But the misjudgment alluded to was of subordinate importance, and the comment reflected a specifically English style of Mandarin self-deprecation rather than a genuine concession of responsibility. There were problems with memory, too. Schmidt tracked down Peter Bach, the former Russian Minister of Finance, now a London banker. In 1914, Bach had participated in meetings at which decisions of momentous importance were made. Yet, when Schmidt met him, Bach insisted that he had little recollection of events from that era. Fortunately, the former minister's own contemporary notes are more informative. When the researcher Luciano Magrini travelled to Belgrade in the autumn of 1937 to interview every surviving figure with a known link to the Sarajevo conspiracy, he found that there were some witnesses who attested to matters of which they could have no knowledge, others who remained dumb or gave a false account of what they know, and others again who added adornments to their statements or were mainly interested in self-justification. There are, moreover, still significant gaps in our knowledge. Many important exchanges between key actors were verbal and are not recorded. They can be reconstructed only from indirect evidence or later testimony. The Serbian organizations linked with the assassination at Sarajevo were extremely secretive and left virtually no paper trail. Dragutin Dimitričević, head of Serbian military intelligence, a key figure in the plot to assassinate Archduke Franz Ferdinand at Sarajevo, regularly burned his papers. So, more unusually, did Dimitričević's enemy, Nikola Pasic, the Serbian Prime Minister. Much remains unknown about the precise content of the earliest discussions between Vienna and Berlin on what should be done in response to the assassinations at Sarajevo. The minutes of the summit meetings that took place between French and Russian political leaderships in St. Petersburg on the 20 to 23rd of June, documents of potentially enormous importance to understanding the last phase of the crisis, have never been found. The Russian protocols were probably simply lost. The French team, entrusted with editing the Document Diplomatique Français, failed to find the French version. The Bolsheviks did publish many key diplomatic documents in an effort to discredit the imperialist machinations of the great powers, but these appeared at irregular intervals in no particular order and were generally focused on specific issues, such as Russian designs on the Bosphorus. Some documents, the exact number is still unknown, were lost in transit during the chaos of the Civil War, and the Soviet Union never produced a systematically compiled documentary record to rival the British, French, German, and Austrian source editions. The published record on the Russian side remains, to this day, far from complete. The exceptionally intricate structure of this crisis is another distinctive feature. The Cuban Missile Crisis was complex enough, yet involved just two principal protagonists, the USA and the Soviet Union, plus a range of proxies and subordinate players. By contrast, the story of how this war came must make sense of the multilateral interactions among 5 autonomous players of equal importance: Germany, Austria-Hungary, France, Russia, and Britain. 6, if we add Italy, plus various other strategically significant and equally autonomous sovereign actors, such as the Ottoman Empire and the states of the Balkan Peninsula, a region of high political tension and instability in the years before the outbreak of war. A further element of convolution arises from the fact that policy-making processes within the states caught up in the crisis were often far from transparent. One can think of July 1914 as an international crisis, a term that suggests an array of nation-states conceived as compact, autonomous, discrete entities like billiard balls on a table. But the sovereign structures that generated policy during the crisis were profoundly disunified. There was uncertainty, and has been ever since among historians, about where exactly the power to shape policy was located within the various executives. And policies, or at least policy-deriving initiatives of various kinds, did not necessarily come from the apex of the system. They could emanate from quite peripheral locations in the diplomatic apparatus, from military commanders, from ministerial officials, and even from ambassadors, who were often policymakers in their own right. The surviving sources thus offer up a chaos of promises, threats, plans, and prognostications, and this in turn helps to explain why the outbreak of this war has proved susceptible to such a bewildering variety of interpretations. There is virtually no viewpoint on its origins that cannot be supported from a selection of the available sources, and this helps in turn to explain why the World War I origins literature has assumed such vast dimensions that no single historian, not even a fantasy figure with an easy command of all the necessary languages, could hope to read it in one lifetime. 20 years ago, an overview of the current literature counted 25,000 books and articles. Some accounts have focused on the culpability of one bad apple state. Germany has been most popular, but not one of the great powers has escaped the ascription of chief responsibility. Others have shared the blame around or have looked for faults in the system. There was always enough complexity to keep the argument going. And around the debates of the historians, which have tended to turn on questions of culpability or the relationship between individual agency and structural constraint, there extends a vast landscape of international relations commentary in which categories such as deterrence, détente, and inadvertence, or universal mechanisms such as balancing, bargaining, and bandwagoning, occupy center stage. Though the debate on this subject is now nearly a century old, there is no reason to believe that it has run its course. But if the debate is old, the subject is still fresh. In fact, it is fresher and more relevant now than it was 20 or 30 years ago. The changes in our own world have altered our perspective on the events of 1914. In the 1960s to 80s, a kind of period charm accumulated in popular awareness around the events of 1914. It was easy to imagine the disaster of Europe's last summer as an Edwardian costume drama. The effete rituals and gaudy uniforms, the ornamentalism of a world still largely organized around hereditary monarchy had a distancing effect on present-day recollection. They seemed to signal that the protagonists were people from another vanished world. The presumption stealthily asserted itself that if the actors' hats had a gaudy green ostrich feathers on them, then their thoughts and motivations probably did too. And yet, what must strike any 21st century reader who follows the course of the summer crisis of 1914 is its raw modernity. It began with a squad of suicide bombers and a cavalcade of automobiles. Behind the outrage at Sarajevo was an avowedly terrorist organization with a cult of sacrifice, death, and revenge. But this terrorist organization was extraterritorial, without a clear geographical or political location. It was scattered in cells across political borders. It was unaccountable. Its links to any sovereign government were oblique, hidden, and certainly very different to discern from outside the organization. Indeed, one could even say that July 1914 is less remote from us, less illegible, now than it was in the 1980s. Since the end of the Cold War, a system of global bipolar stability has made way for a more complex and unpredictable array of forces, including declining empires and rising powers, a state of affairs that invites comparison with the Europe of 1914. These shifts in perspective prompt us to rethink the story of how war came to Europe in 1914. Accepting this challenge does not mean embracing a vulgar presentism that remakes the past to meet the needs of the present, but rather acknowledging those features of the past of which our changed vantage point can afford us a clearer view. Among these is the Balkan context of the war's inception. Serbia is one of the blind spots in the historiography of the July crisis. The assassination at Sarajevo is treated in many accounts as a mere pretext, an event with little bearing on the real forces whose interaction brought about the conflict. In an excellent recent account of the outbreak of war in 1914, the authors declare that the killings at Sarajevo by themselves caused nothing. It was the use made of this event that brought the nations to war. The marginalization of the Serbian and thereby of the larger Balkan dimension of the story began during the July crisis itself, which opened as a response to the murders at Sarajevo, but later changed gear, entering a geopolitical phase in which Serbia and its actions occupied a subordinate place. Our moral compass has shifted too. The fact that Serbian-dominated Yugoslavia emerged as one of the victor states of the war seemed implicitly to vindicate the act of the man who pulled the trigger on 28th of June. Certainly that was the view of the Yugoslav authorities, who marked the spot where he did so with bronze footprints and a plaque celebrating assassins' first steps into Yugoslav freedom. In an era when the national idea was still fresh and full of promise, there was an intuitive sympathy with the South Slav nationalism and little sympathy for the ponderous multinational commonwealth of the Habsburg Empire. The Yugoslav wars of the 1990s have reminded us of the lethality of the Balkan nationalism. Since Srebrenica and the siege of Sarajevo, it has become harder to think of Serbia as the mere object or victim of great power politics, and easier to conceive of Serbian nationalism as an historical force in its own right. From the perspective of today's European Union, we are inclined to look more sympathetically, or at least less contemptuously, than we used to on the vanished imperial patchwork of Habsburg Austria-Hungary. Lastly, it is perhaps less obvious now that we should dismiss the two killings at Sarajevo as a mere mishap incapable of carrying real causal weight. The attack on the World Trade Center in September 2001 exemplified the way in which a single symbolic event, however deeply it may be enmeshed in larger historical processes, can change politics irrevocably, rendering old options obsolete and endowing new ones with an unforeseen urgency. Putting Sarajevo and the Balkans back at the center of the story does not mean demonizing the Serbs or their statesmen, nor does it dispense us from the obligation to understand the forces working on and in those Serbian politicians, officers, and activists whose behavior and decisions help to determine what kind of consequences the shootings at Sarajevo would have. This book, thus, strives to understand the July crisis of 1914 as a modern event, the most complex of modern times, perhaps of any time so far. It is concerned less with why the war happened than with how it came about. Questions of why and how are logically inseparable, but they lead us in different directions. The questions of how invites us to look closely at the sequences of interactions that produce certain outcomes. By contrast, the question of why invites us to go in search of remote and categorical causes. Imperialism, nationalism, armaments, alliances, high finance, ideas of national honor, the mechanics of mobilization. The why approach brings a certain analytical clarity, but it also has a distorting effect, because it creates the illusion of a steadily building causal pressure. The factors pile up on top of each other, pushing down on the events. Political actors become mere executors of forces long established and beyond their control. The story this book tells is, by contrast, saturated with agency. The key decision-makers, kings, emperors, foreign ministers, ambassadors, military commanders, and a host of lesser officials walk towards danger in watchful, calculated steps. The outbreak of war was the culmination of chains of decisions made by political actors with conscious objectives, who were capable of a degree of self-reflection, acknowledged a range of options, and formed the best judgments they could on the basis of the best information they had to hand. Nationalism, armaments, alliances, and finance were all part of the story, but they can be made to carry real explanatory weight only if they can be seen to have shaped the decisions that, in combination, made war break out. A Bulgarian historian of the Balkan Wars recently observed that once we pose the question, why, guilt becomes the focal point. Questions of guilt and responsibility in the outbreak of war entered this story even before the war had begun. The entire source record is full of ascriptions of blame, This was a world in which aggressive intentions were always assigned to the opponent and defensive intentions to oneself. And the judgment delivered by Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles has ensured the continuing prominence of the war guilt question. Here, too, the focus on how suggests an alternative approach, a journey through the events that is not driven by the need to draw up a charge sheet against this or that state or individual, but aims to identify the decisions that brought war about and to understand the reasoning or emotions behind them. This does not mean excluding questions of responsibility entirely from the discussion. The aim is rather to let the why answers grow, as it were, out of the how answers, rather than the other way round. This book tells the story of how war came to continental Europe. It traces the paths to war in a multi-layered narrative encompassing the key decision centers in Vienna, Berlin, St. Petersburg, Paris, London, and Belgrade, with brief excursions to Rome, Constantinople, and Sofia. It is divided into 3 parts. Part 1 focuses on the 2 antagonists, Serbia and Austria-Hungary, whose quarrel ignited the conflict, following their interaction down to the eve of the Sarajevo assassinations. Part 2 breaks with the narrative approach to ask 4 questions in 4 chapters. How did the polarization of Europe into opposed blocks of alliance come about? How did the governments of the European states generate foreign policy? How did the Balkans, a peripheral region far from Europe's centers of power and wealth, come to be the theater of a crisis of such magnitude? How did an international system that seemed to be entering an era détente produce a general war? Part 3 opens with the assassinations at Sarajevo and offers a narrative of the July crisis itself, examining the interactions between the key decision centers and bringing to light the calculations, misunderstanding, and decisions that drove the crisis from one phase to the next. It is a central argument of this book that the events of July 1914 make sense only when we illuminate the journeys traveled by the key decision-makers informing their view of events. To do this, we need to do more than simply revisit the sequence of international crises that preceded the outbreak of war. We need to understand how those events were experienced and woven into narratives that structured perceptions and motivated behavior. Why did the men whose decisions took Europe to war behave and see things as they did? How did the sense of fearfulness and foreboding that one finds in so many of the sources connect with the arrogance and swaggering we encounter, often in the very same individuals? Why did such exotic features of the pre-war scene as the Albanian question and the Bulgarian loan matter so much, and how were they joined up in the heads of those who had political power? When decision-makers discoursed on the international situation or external threats, were they seeing something real or projecting their own fears and desires onto their opponents, or both? The aim has been to reconstruct as vividly as possible the highly dynamic decision positions occupied by the key actors before and during the summer of 1914. Some of the most interesting recent writing on this war has argued that far from being inevitable, this war was in fact improbable, at least until it actually happened. From this it would follow that the conflict was not the consequence of a long-run deterioration, but of short-term shocks to the international system. Whether one accepts this view or not, it has the merit of opening the story to an element of contingency. And it is certainly true that while some of the developments I examine in this book seem to point unequivocally to the direction of what actually transpired in 1914, there are other vectors of pre-war change that suggest different, unrealized outcomes. With this in mind, the book aims to show how the pieces of causality were assembled that, once in place, enabled the war to happen, but to do so without over-determining the outcome. I have tried to remain alert to the fact that the people, events, and forces described in this book carried in them the seeds of other, perhaps less terrible futures. Part 1. Roads to Sarajevo. 1. Serbian Ghosts. Murder in Belgrade. Shortly after 2 o'clock on the morning of 11th of June 1903, 28 officers of the Serbian Army approached the main entrance of the Royal Palace in Belgrade. After an exchange of fire, the sentries standing guard before the building were arrested and disarmed. With keys taken from the duty captain, the conspirators broke into the reception hall and made for the royal bedchamber, hurrying up stairways and along corridors. Finding the king's apartments barred by a pair of heavy oaken doors, the conspirators blew them open with a carton of dynamite. The charge was so strong that the doors were torn from their hinges and thrown across the antechamber inside, killing the royal adjutant behind them. The blast also fused the palace electrics so that the building was plunged into darkness. Unperturbed, the intruders discovered some candles in a nearby room and entered the royal apartment. By the time they reached the bedroom, King Alexander and Queen Draga were no longer to be found. But the Queen's French novel was splayed face down on the bedside table. Someone touched the sheets and felt that the bed was still warm. It seemed that they had only recently left. Having searched the bedchamber in vain, the intruders combed through the palace with candles and drawn revolvers. While the officers strode from room to room, firing at cabinets, tapestries, sofas, and other potential hiding places, King Alexander and Queen Draga huddled upstairs in a tiny annex adjoining the bedchamber where the Queen's maid usually ironed and darned her clothes. For nearly 2 hours, the search continued. The king took advantage of this interlude to dress as quietly as he could in a pair of trousers and a red silk shirt. He had no wish to be found naked by his enemies. The queen managed to cover herself in a petticoat, white silk, stays, and a single yellow stocking. Across Belgrade, other victims were found and killed. The queen's 2 brothers, widely suspected of harboring designs on the Serbian throne, were induced to leave their sister's home in Belgrade and taken to a guardhouse close to the palace, where they were insulted and barbarously stabbed. Assassins also broke into the apartments of the Prime Minister, Dmitry Cincar-Marcevich, and the Minister of War, Milovan Pavlovich. Both were slain. 25 rounds were fired into Pavlovich, who had concealed himself in a wooden chest. Interior Minister Belamir Theodorovich was shot and mistakenly left for dead, but later recovered from his wounds. Other ministers were placed under arrest. Back at the palace, the king's loyal first adjutant, Lazar Petrovich, who had been disarmed and seized after an exchange of fire, was led through the darkened halls by the assassins and forced to call out to the king from every door. Returning to the royal chamber for a second search, the conspirators at last found a concealed entry behind the drapery. When one of the assailants proposed to cut the wall open with an axe, Petrovich saw that the game was up and agreed to ask the king to come out. From behind the panelling, the king inquired who was calling, to which his adjutant responded, "I am, your Lazar. Open the door to your officers." The king replied, "Can I trust the oath of my officers?" The conspirators replied in the affirmative. According to one account, the king, flabby, bespectacled, and incongruously dressed in his red silk shirt, emerged with his arms around the queen. The couple were cut down in a hail of shots at point-blank range. Petrovich, who drew a concealed revolver in a final, hopeless bid to protect his master, or so it was later claimed, was also killed. An orgy of gratuitous violence followed. The corpses were stabbed with swords, torn with a bayonet, partially disemboweled and hacked with an axe until they were mutilated beyond recognition. According to the later testimony of the king's traumatized Italian barber, who was ordered to collect the bodies and dress them for burial. The body of the queen was hoisted to the railing of the bedroom window and tossed, virtually naked and slimy with gore, into the gardens. It was reported that as the assassins attempted to do the same with Alexander, one of his hands closed momentarily around the railing. An officer hacked through the fist with a sabre, and the body fell with a sprinkle of severed digits to the earth. By the time the assassins had gathered in the gardens to have a smoke and inspect the results of their handiwork, it had begun to rain. The events of 11th June 1903 marked a new departure in Serbian political history. The Obrenović dynasty that had ruled Serbia throughout most of the country's brief life as a modern independent state was no more. Within hours of the assassination, the conspirators announced the termination of the Obrenović line and the succession to the throne of Petar Karađorđević, currently living in Swiss exile. Why was there such a brutal reckoning with the Obrenović dynasty? Monarchy had never established a stable institutional existence in Serbia. The root of the problem lay partly in the coexistence of rival dynastic families. Two great clans, the Obrenović and Karađorđević, had distinguished themselves in the struggle to liberate Serbia from the Ottoman control. The swarthy former cattle herd, Black George, Serbian Karađorđe Petrović, founder of the Karađorđević line, led an uprising in 1804 that succeeded for some years in driving the Ottomans out of Serbia, but fled into Austrian exile in 1813 when the Ottomans mounted a counter-offensive. 2 years later, a second uprising unfolded under the leadership of Miloš Obrenović, a supple political operator who succeeded in negotiating the recognition of a Serbian principality with the Ottoman authorities. When Karađorđević returned to Serbia from exile, he was assassinated on the orders of Obrenović and with the connivance of the Ottomans. Having dispatched his main political rival, Obrenović was granted the title of Prince of Serbia. Members of the Obrenović clan ruled Serbia during most of its existence as a principality within the Ottoman Empire, 1817 to 1878. The pairing of rival dynasties, an exposed location between the Ottoman and the Austrian empires, and a markedly deferential political culture dominated by peasant smallholders, these factors in combination ensured that monarchy remained an embattled institution. It is striking how few of the 19th century Serbian regents died on the throne of natural causes. The principality's founder, Prince Miloš Obrenović, was a brutal autocrat whose reign was scarred by frequent rebellions. In the summer of 1839, Miloš abdicated in favor of his eldest son, Milan, who was so ill with measles that he was still unaware of his elevation when he died 13 days later. The reign of the younger son, Mihailo, came to a premature halt when he was deposed by a rebellion in 1842, making way for the installation of a Karađorđević, none other than Alexander, the son of Black George. But in 1858, Alexander too was forced to abdicate, to be succeeded again by Mihailo, who returned to the throne in 1860. Mihailo was no more popular during his second reign than he had been during his first. 8 years later, he was assassinated, together with a female cousin, in a plot that may have been supported by the Karađorđević clan. The long reign of Mihailo's successor, Prince Milan Obrenović, 1868 to 1889, provided a degree of political continuity. In 1882, 4 years after the Congress of Berlin had accorded Serbia the status of an independent state, Milan proclaimed it a kingdom and himself king. But high levels of political turbulence remained a problem. In 1883, the government's efforts to decommission the firearms of peasant militias in north and eastern Serbia triggered a major provincial uprising, the Timoc Rebellion. Milan responded with brutal reprisals against the rebels and a witch hunt against senior political figures in Belgrade suspected of having fomented the unrest. Serbian political culture was transformed in the early 1880s by the emergence of political parties of the modern type with newspapers, caucuses, manifestos, campaign strategies, and local committees. To this formidable new force in public life, the king responded with autocratic measures. When elections in 1883 produced a hostile majority in the Serbian parliament, known as the Skupština, the king refused to appoint a government recruited from the dominant radical party, choosing instead to assemble a cabinet of bureaucrats. The Skupština was opened by decree and then closed again by decree 10 minutes later. A disastrous war against Bulgaria in 1885, the result of royal executive decisions made without any consultation either with ministers or with parliament, and an acrimonious and scandalous divorce from his wife, Queen Natalie, further undermined the monarch's standing. When Milan abdicated in 1889, in the hope, among other things, of marrying the pretty young wife of his personal secretary, his departure seemed long overdue. The regency put in place to manage Serbian affairs during the minority of Milan's son, Crown Prince Alexander, lasted 4 years. In 1893, at the age of only 16, Alexander overthrew the regency in a bizarre coup d'etat. The cabinet ministers were invited to dinner and cordially informed in the course of a toast that they were all under arrest. The young king announced that he intended to arrogate to himself full royal power. Key ministerial buildings and the telegraph administration had already been occupied by the military. The citizens of Belgrade awoke on the following morning to find the city plastered with posters decreeing that Alexander had seized power. In reality, ex-King Milan was still managing events from behind the scenes. It was Milan who had set up the regency, and it was Milan who engineered the coup on behalf of his son. In a grotesque family maneuver for which it is hard to find any contemporary European parallel, the abdicated father served as chief advisor to the royal son. During the years 1897 to 1900, this arrangement was formalized in the Milan-Alexander duarchy. King Father Milan was appointed Supreme Commander of the Serbian Army, the first civilian ever to hold this office. During Alexander's reign, the history of the Obrenović dynasty entered its terminal phase. Supported from the sidelines by his father, Alexander quickly squandered the hopeful goodwill that often attends the inauguration of a new regime. He ignored the relatively liberal provisions of the Serbian constitution, imposing instead a form of neo-absolutist rule. Secret ballots were eliminated, press freedoms were rescinded, newspapers were closed down. When the leadership of the Radical Party protested, they found themselves excluded from the exercise of power. Alexander abolished, imposed, and suspended constitutions in the manner of a tin-pot dictator. He showed no respect for the independence of the judiciary and even plotted against the lives of senior politicians. The spectacle of the king and the king father, Milan, recklessly operating the levers of the state in tandem, not to mention Queen Mother Natalie, who remained an important figure behind the scenes despite the breakdown of her marriage with Milan, had a devastating impact on the standing of the dynasty. Alexander's decision to marry the disreputable widow of an obscure engineer did nothing to improve the situation. He had met Draga Masin in 1897, when she was serving as a maid of honor to his mother. Draga was 10 years older than the king, unpopular with Belgrade society, widely believed to be infertile and well known for her allegedly numerous sexual liaisons. During a heated meeting of the Crown Council, when ministers attempted in vain to dissuade the king from marrying Masin, the Interior Minister George Jencic came up with a powerful argument. "Sire, you cannot marry her. She has been everybody's mistress, mine included." The minister's reward for his candor was a hard slap across the face. Jencic would later join the ranks of the regicide conspiracy. There were similar encounters with other senior officials. At one rather overwrought cabinet meeting, the acting prime minister even proposed placing the king under the palace arrest or having him bundled out of the country by force in order to prevent the union from being solemnized. So intense was the opposition to Masin among the political classes that the king found it impossible for a time to recruit suitable candidates into senior posts. The news of Alexander and Draga's engagement alone was enough to trigger the resignation of the entire cabinet, and the king was obliged to make do with an eclectic wedding cabinet of little-known figures. The controversy over the marriage also strained the relationship between the king and his father. Milan was so outraged at the prospect of Draga's becoming his daughter-in-law that he resigned his post as commander-in-chief of the army. In a letter written to his son in June 1900, he declared that Alexander was pushing Serbia into an abyss and closed with a forthright warning. "I shall be the first to cheer the government which shall drive you from the country after such a folly on your part." Alexander went ahead just the same with his plan. He and Draga were married on 23rd of June 1900 in Belgrade, and exploited the opportunity created by his father's resignation to reinforce his own control over the officer corps. There was a purge of Milan's friends and Draga's enemies from the senior military and civil service posts. The king father was kept under constant surveillance, then encouraged to leave Serbia, and later prevented from returning. It was something of a relief to the royal couple when Milan, who had settled in Austria, died in January 1901. There was a brief revival in the monarchy's popularity late in 1900, when an announcement by the palace that the Queen was expecting a child prompted a wave of public sympathy. But the outrage was correspondingly intense in April 1901, when it was revealed that Draga's pregnancy had been a ruse designed to placate public opinion. Rumours spread in the capital of a foiled plan to establish a superstitious infant as heir to the Serbian throne. Ignoring these ill omens, Alexander launched a propaganda cult around his queen, celebrating her birthday with lavish public events and naming regiments, schools, and even villages after her. At the same time, his constitutional manipulations became bolder. On one famous occasion in March 1903, the king suspended the Serbian constitution in the middle of the night while repressive new press and association laws were hurried onto the statute books, and then reinstated just 45 minutes later. By the spring of 1903, Alexander and Draga had united most of the Serbian society against them. The Radical Party, which had won an absolute majority of Skupština seats in the elections of July 1901, resented the king's autocratic manipulations. Among the powerful mercantile and banking families, especially those involved in the export of cattle and foodstuffs, there were many who saw the pro-Vienna bias of Abramovich foreign policy as locking the Serbian economy into an Austrian monopoly and depriving the country's capitalists of access to world markets. On 6th of April 1903, a demonstration in Belgrade decrying the king's constitutional manipulations was brutally dispersed by police and gendarmes, who killed 18 and wounded about 50 others. Over 100 people, including a number of army officers, were arrested and imprisoned, though most were freed after a few days. At the epicenter of the deepening opposition to the crown was the Serbian Army. By the turn of the 20th century, the army was one of the most dynamic institutions in Serbian society. In a still largely rural and underperforming economy, where careers offering upward mobility were hard to come by, an officer commission was a privileged route to status and influence. This preeminence had been reinforced by King Milan, who lavished funding on the military, expanding the officer corps while cutting back the state's already meagre expenditure on higher education. But the fat years came to an abrupt end after the King Father's departure in 1900. Alexander pruned back the military budget, officers' salaries were allowed to fall months into arrears, and a policy of court favoritism ensured that friends or relatives of the king and his wife were promoted to key posts over the heads of their colleagues. These resentments were sharpened by the widespread belief, despite official denials, that the king, having failed to generate a biological heir, was planning to designate Queen Draga's brother, Nikoji Lunijević, as successor to the Serbian throne. During the summer of 1901, a military conspiracy crystallized around a gifted young lieutenant of the Serbian Army who would play an important role in the events of July 1914. Later known as Api because of his heavy build reminded his admirers of the broad-shouldered bull god of ancient Egypt, Dragutin Dimitrijev had been appointed to a post on the general staff immediately after his graduation from the Serbian Military Academy, a sure sign of the great esteem in which he was held by his superiors. Dimitrijev was made for the world of political conspiracy. Obsessively secretive, utterly dedicated to his military and political work, ruthless in his methods and icily composed in moments of crisis, Api was not a man who could have held sway over a great popular movement. But he did possess in abundance the capacity within small groups and private circles to win and groom disciples, to confer a sense of importance upon his following, to silence doubts and to motivate extreme action. One collaborator described him as a secret force at whose disposal I have to place myself, though my reason gives me no grounds for doing so. Another of the regicides puzzled over the reasons for Api's influence. Neither his intelligence, nor his eloquence, nor the force of his ideas seemed sufficient to account for it. Yet he was the only one among us who, solely by his presence, was able to turn my thoughts into his stream, and with a few words spoken in the most ordinary manner could make out of me an obedient executor of his will. The milieu in which Dimitrijev employed these gifts was emphatically masculine. Women were a marginal presence in his adult life. He never showed any sexual interest in them. His natural habitat and the scene of all his intrigues was the smoke-filled men-only world of the Belgrade coffee houses, a space at once private and public where conversations could be seen without necessarily being heard. The best-known surviving photograph of him depicts the burly mustachioed intriguer with two associates in a characteristically conspiratorial pose. Dimitrijev originally planned to kill the royal couple at a ball in central Belgrade on 11th September, the Queen's birthday. In a plan that seems lifted from the pages of an Ian Fleming novel, 2 officers were assigned to mount an attack on the Danube power plant that supplied Belgrade with electricity, while another was to disable the smaller station serving the building where the ball was in progress. Once the lights were shut off, the 4 assassins in attendance at the ball planned to set fire to the curtains, sound the fire alarms, and liquidate the king and his wife by forcing them to ingest poison. This method was chosen in order to circumvent a possible search for firearms. The poison was successfully tested on a cat, but in every other respect the plan was a failure. The power plant turned out to be too heavily guarded, and the Queen decided in any case not to attend the ball. Undeterred by this and other failed attempts, the conspirators worked hard over the next 2 years at expanding the scope of the coup. Over 100 officers were recruited, including many younger military men. By the end of 1901, there were also contacts with civilian political leaders, among them the former Interior Minister George Jencic, he who had been slapped for his candid objections to the king's marriage plans. In the autumn of 1902, the conspiracy was given formal expression in a secret oath. Drawn up by Dmitrichev, Appy, it was refreshingly straightforward about the object of the enterprise. Anticipating certain collapse of the state and blaming for this primarily the king and his paramour Dragan Masin, we swear that we shall murder them and to that effect affix our signatures. By the spring of 1903, when the plot encompassed between 120 and 150 conspirators, the plan to kill the royal couple inside their own palace was mature. Carrying it out required extensive preparation, however, because the king and his wife, falling prey to an entirely justified paranoia, stepped up their security arrangements. The king never appeared in town except in the company of a crowd of attendants. Draga was so terrified of attack that she had at one point confined herself to the palace for 6 weeks. Guard details in and around the building were doubled. The rumours of an impending coup were so widespread that the London Times of 27th of April 1903 would cite a confidential Belgrade source to the effect that there exists a military conspiracy against the throne of such an extent that neither king nor government dare take steps to crush it. The recruitment of key insiders, including officers from the palace guard and the king's own aide-de-camp, provided the assassins with a means of picking their way past the successive lines of sentries and gaining access to the inner sanctum. The date of the attack was chosen just 3 days in advance, when it was known that all the conspirators would be in place and on duty at their respective posts. It was agreed that the thing must be done in the greatest possible haste, and then be made known immediately in order to forestall any intervention by the police or by regiments remaining loyal to the king. The desire to advertise the success of the enterprise as soon as it was accomplished may help to explain the decision to toss the royal corpses from the bedroom balcony. Appy joined the killing squad that broke into the palace, but he missed the final act of the drama. He was shot and seriously wounded in an exchange of fire with guards inside the main entrance. He collapsed on the spot, lost consciousness, and only narrowly escaped bleeding to death. Irresponsible elements. Town quiet, people generally seemed unmoved, noted Sir John Bonham, the British minister in Belgrade, in a lapidary dispatch to London on the evening of 11th of June. The Serbian Revolution, Bonham reported, had been hailed with open satisfaction by the inhabitants of the capital. The day following the murders was kept as a holiday and the streets decorated with flags. There was an entire absence of decent regret. The most striking feature of the Serbian tragedy, declared Sir Francis Plunkett, Bonham's colleague in Vienna, was the extraordinary calmness with which the execution of such an atrocious crime had been accepted. Hostile observers saw in this equanimity of mood evidence of the heartlessness of a nation by long tradition inured to violence and regicide. In reality, the citizens of Belgrade had good reason to welcome the assassinations. The conspirators immediately turned power over to an all-party provisional government. The parliament was swiftly reconvened. Petar Karađorđević was recalled from his Swiss exile and elected king by the parliament. The emphatically democratic constitution of 1888 was now renamed the Constitution of 1903, was reinstated with some minor modifications. The age-old problem of the rivalry between two Serbian dynasties was suddenly a thing of the past. The fact that Karađorđević, who had spent much of his life in France and Switzerland, was an aficionado of John Stuart Mill, in his younger days he had even translated Mill's On Liberty into Serbian, was encouraging to those with liberal instincts. Even more reassuring was Petar's proclamation to the people, delivered shortly after his return from exile, that he intended to reign as the truly constitutional king of Serbia. The kingdom now became a genuinely parliamentary polity, in which the monarch reigned but did not govern. The murder during the coup of the repressive Prime Minister Chinchar Markovic, a favourite of Alexander, was a clear signal that political power would henceforth depend upon popular support and party networks, rather than on the goodwill of the crown. Political parties could go about their work without fear of reprisals. The press was at last free of censorship that had been the norm under the Obrenović rulers. The prospect beckoned of a national political life more responsive to popular needs and more in tune with public opinion. Serbia stood on the threshold of a new epoch in its political existence. But if the coup of 1903 resolved some issues, it also created new problems that weigh heavily on the events of 1914. Above all, the conspiratorial network that had come together to murder the royal family did not simply melt away, but remained an important force in Serbian politics and public life. The provisional revolutionary government formed on the day after the assassinations included 4 conspirators, among them the ministers of war, public works and economics, and 6 party politicians. Appy, still recovering from his bullet wounds, was formally thanked for what he had done by the Skupština and became a national hero. The fact that the new regime depended for its existence on the bloody work of the conspirators, combined with the fear of what the network might still be capable of, made an open criticism difficult. One minister in the new government confided to a newspaper correspondent 10 days after the event that he found the actions of the assassins deplorable, but was unable to characterize them openly in such terms owing to the feeling which it might create in the army, on the support of which both the throne and government depend. The regicide network was especially influential at court. So far, the British envoy Wilfred Thesiger reported from Belgrade in November 1905, the conspirator officers have formed His Majesty's most important and even sole support. Their removal would leave the crown without any party whose devotion or even friendship could be relied on. It was thus hardly surprising that when King Petar looked in the winter of 1905 for a companion to accompany his son, Crown Prince George, on a journey across Europe, he should choose none other than Appy, fresh from a long convalescence and still carrying 3 of the bullets that had entered his body on the night of the assassinations. The chief architect of the regicide was thus charged with seeing the next Karađorđević king through to the end of his education as prince. In the event, George never became king. He disqualified himself from the Serbian succession in 1909 by kicking his valet to death. The Austrian minister in Belgrade could thus report with only slight exaggeration that the king remained, even after his election by the parliament, the prisoner of those who had brought him into power. The king is a nullity, one senior official at the Austrian Foreign Office concluded at the end of November. The whole show is run by the people of 11th of June. The conspirators used this leverage to secure for themselves the most desirable military and government posts. The newly appointed royal adjutants were all conspirators, as were the ordnance officers and the chief of the postal department in the Ministry of War. And the conspirators were able to influence military appointments, including senior command positions. Using their privileged access to the monarch, they also exercised an influence over the political questions of national importance. The machinations of the regicides did not go unchallenged. There was external pressure on the new government to detach itself from the network, especially from Britain, which withdrew its minister plenipotentiary and left litigation in the hands of the chargé d'affaires Thesiger. As late as autumn 1905, many symbolically important Belgrade functions, especially events at court, were still being boycotted by representatives of the European great powers. Within the army itself, a military counter-conspiracy concentrated in the fortress town of Niš emerged under the leadership of Captain Milan Novaković, who produced a manifesto calling for the dismissal from the service of 68 named prominent regicides. Novaković was swiftly arrested, and after a spirited defense of his actions, he and his accomplices were tried, found guilty, and sentenced to varying periods of imprisonment by a military court. When he left prison 2 years later, Novaković resumed his public attacks on the regicides and was incarcerated again. In September 1907, he and a male relative perished in mysterious circumstances during an alleged escape attempt, a scandal that triggered outrage in Parliament and the liberal press. The question of the relationship between the army and the civilian authorities thus remained unresolved after the assassinations of 1903, a state of affairs that would shape Serbia's handling of events in 1914. The man who shouldered the lion's shares of the responsibility for managing this challenging constellation was the radical leader Nikola Pasic. Pasic, a Zurich-trained engineering graduate, was the kingdom's dominant statesman after the regicide. During the years of 1904 to 18, he headed 10 cabinets for a total of 9 years. As the man who stood at the apex of Serbian politics before, during, and after the Sarajevo assassinations in 1914, Pasic would be one of the key players in the crisis that preceded the outbreak of the First World War. This was surely one of the most remarkable political careers in modern European history, not just on account of its longevity. Pasic was active in Serbian politics for over 40 years, but also because of the alternation of moments of giddy triumph with situations of extreme peril. Though he was nominally an engineer, politics consumed his entire existence. This is one of the reasons why he remained unmarried until the age of 45. From the beginning, he was deeply committed to the struggle for Serbian independence from foreign sovereignty. In 1875, when there was a revolt against Turkish rule in Bosnia, the young Pasic travelled there as correspondent for the irredentist newspaper Narodne Oslobodenice, National Liberation, in order to send dispatches from the front line of the Serbian national struggle. In the early 1880s, he oversaw the modernization of the Radical Party, which would remain the single most powerful force in Serbian politics until the outbreak of the First World War. The Radicals embodied an eclectic politics that combined liberal constitutional ideas with calls for Serbian expansion and the territorial unification of all the Serbs of the Balkan Peninsula. The popular base of the party, and the key to its enduring electoral success, was the small-holding peasantry that made up the bulk of the country's population. As a party of peasants, the Radicals embraced a variety of populism that linked them to pan-Slavist groups in Russia. They were suspicious of the professional army, not only because they resented the fiscal burdens imposed to maintain it, but also because they remained wedded to the peasant militia as the best and most natural form of armed organization. During the Timoc Revolution of 1883, the Radicals sided with the arms-bearing peasants against the government, and the suppression of the uprising was followed by reprisals against radical leaders. Pasic was among those who came under suspicion. He fled into exile just in time to escape arrest and was sentenced to death in absentia. During his years in exile, he established enduring contacts in St. Petersburg and became the darling of pan-Slav circles. Thereafter, his policy was always closely linked with Russian policy. After Milan's abdication in 1889, Pasic, whose exile had established him as a hero of the radical movement, was pardoned. He returned to Belgrade amid popular adulation to be elected president of the Skupština and then mayor of the capital city. But his first tenure as prime minister, February 1891 to August 1892, ended with his resignation in protest at the continuing extra-constitutional manipulations of Milan and the regents. In 1893, following his coup against the regency, Alexander dispatched Pasic to St. Petersburg as Serbian envoy extraordinary. The aim was to placate Pasic's political ambition while at the same time removing him from Belgrade. Pasic worked hard to build a deeper Russian-Serbian relationship, making no secret of his belief that the future national emancipation of Serbia would ultimately depend on the Russian assistance. But this work was disrupted by the re-entry into the Belgrade politics of King Father Milan. Radicals were hounded and purged from the civil service, and Pasic was recalled. In the years of the Milan-Alexander reign, Pasic was closely watched and kept at arm's length from power. In 1898, he was sentenced to 9 months in prison on the pretext that he had insulted Milan in a party publication. Pasic was still in prison in 1899 when the country was shaken by a botched attempt on the King Father's life. Once again, the Radicals were suspected of complicity in the plot, though their link with young Bosnian who fired the shot was and remains unclear. King Alexander demanded that Pasic be executed on suspicion of complicity in the assassination attempt, but the radical leader's life was saved, ironically enough in view of later developments, by the urgent representations of the Austro-Hungarian government. In a ruse characteristic of Alexander's reign, Pasic was informed that he would be executed along with a dozen of his radical colleagues, unless he signed an admission of moral co-responsibility for the assassination attempt. Unaware that his life had already been saved by Vienna's intervention, Pasic consented. The document was published, and he emerged from prison under popular suspicion that he had incriminated his party in order to save his own skin. He was biologically alive, but, for the moment at least, politically dead. During the troubled final years of Alexander's reign, he withdrew almost entirely from public life. The change of regime inaugurated a golden age in Pasic's political career. He and his party were now the dominant